Hi there, Paul Kirtley here. Good to see you. Today I want to share 3 distinct axe techniques with you that I use all the time when I'm working in the woods, when I'm living in the woods, and when I'm undertaking trips, wilderness expeditions, whether they're in the winter or the summer, when I need firewood particularly. And this is something that many people are going to find useful. I'm going to use a range of different axes, and again, these are very typical of axes that people have, particularly in the bushcraft sphere, if you like, the bushcraft and wilderness living skills community. These are very popular axes, both in terms of the particular models, but also the style of axes. So this will be relevant to a lot of people. And one of the key things here is that I don't have a chopping block. If I'm at home splitting firewood to season, to put in the woodshed, to stack outside, to put away, I'm probably going to have a setup where I've got a chopping block, I've got a maul, or at least a very good splitting axe, and I've got a particular area where I'm going to do that and I can be efficient. What we're talking about here is when we're out in the woods, out in the bush, whether we're living out for a period of time, whether we're working on a course, whether we are undertaking a journey, and we are much less likely to have a big chopping block, and we're certainly not going to have a big splitting axe with us if we're undertaking a journey. So let's start off with this size of axe. This is what we might call generically a half-length axe. It comes about halfway from my fingers to my sternum, to my breastbone there. Some people refer to these as boys' axes, which I think is a little bit derogatory. In terms of the Gransfors model, which a lot of people have, we're talking about the small forest axe, and a lot of people refer to this size axe as a small forest axe. The head is about 700 grams. I'll put the pounds and ounces, etc., weights for everything that I talk about today in a little information bar on the video for people that want it that way, if you're not working in metric. And I've talked about these axes before in other videos. What I want to talk about here is a specific technique, okay? And I don't have a chopping block, as I say. So mask always goes in my pocket. Make sure that I'm not going to lose that, particularly if I'm on a journey. I want to protect myself and the rest of my gear from that. So what we're talking about is splitting some firewood, okay? And what I've done is I've sawn up some dead standing wood into lengths that is about the same length as the axe, okay? And that's kind of important, all right? And I'll come back to size and shape very shortly, but I'll show you the technique. So I'm kneeling. And there's a lot that makes kneeling very safe with short axes, and I'm working on a piece of wood. This is a piece of a log. It could even be smaller than this. I'll come back to that again shortly. It could be a felled tree, a down tree, a windblown tree, anything that you can work on that's horizontal that isn't really going to move very far. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring these two together, the axes over the end here. You can have it extending a little bit or there. What you don't want is it in the middle there somewhere. And then the handle can rest on the other end. That's one of the advantages of having it the same length or very similar length to the axe. We'll look at some other situations where it isn't the same length shortly, but this is what I'm aiming for, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the axe down over the wood that I'm working on, like so. So the axe is over the wood. What I don't want to be doing is this, where it's extending beyond, and I certainly don't want to be working on this side. That would be silly. But what I want to do is aim so that the axe, ideally when it goes through, is going to come into this wood, because we've got dirt down there, we've got maybe rock down there, and this is quite thick, this log, okay? But as I say, we could use something thinner. I could be working on this even, okay? This will work just as well. All right, I am hunched over just slightly more, but not very much. And here it's really important that the axe doesn't go through and miss the wood, because then the edge of my axe is going into the dirt, and there's grit and there's stones there. Or I could be working on granite. I could be on the Canadian Shield, for example, in a campground, undertaking a wilderness trip. and I don't want to go straight into granite. I don't even want to go into soil that's a bit sandy or a bit gritty. So I'm going over here to protect my axe. And also that's more efficient as well. And what I'm going to do is just tap that slightly, and you can see that that's embedded now. The axe is actually holding the wood. The two are mated together. Now I'm going to hit it harder. Okay, and that's gone through, and I'm going to turn the wood. The reason I don't turn the axe like so is because that could be, particularly with a larger piece, but even with a small piece, it could be embedded. I'll try not to hit it that hard, but it could be embedded. And then I'm trying to turn, if I'm trying to turn the axe to split the wood, I'm trying to turn the whole thing, which is not going to split the wood. I'm trying to turn this, and that won't split this piece of wood. I'm much better off turning that there and keeping this steady. So you want to keep that as a habit, all right? So that's split nicely. Now I'm going to split this piece here. This could be main fuel for my fire, but maybe I want to split it further down for kindling. So it's much easier for me to balance the axe bit there on the flat side than it is on a rounded side. So I'm going to go for the flat side and attack the grain directly, again over the piece of wood, tap it a little bit, and then turn and split. Okay. Now, I've got a quarter. Balancing the axe there is awkward. So I'm going to do it on the rounded side. That is easier. And split there. Okay. Now these will be really nice for feather sticks, or just for kindling, or the hearthboard for your fire. Okay. The other nice thing about this technique is it's really quite safe. It's not particularly dynamic. Quite controlled. I could be quite close to the fire where it's needed. I could be in the vestibule of a tent. I could be quite close to other people. I'm not throwing the axe around very much. There aren't pieces of wood flying out, and it's all very nice and controlled, which is another reason why I like it for around camp, on trips, or just when we're living and working in the woods. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some constraints on this. You'll notice that this split really nicely. Woods that split really nicely, that are straight grained, are going to give you a nice even split. So some of the softwoods, some of the pines, even some of the hardwoods like this is sweet chestnut, ash for example, a lot of the ash species will split nicely. So there's lots of different things. So your knowledge of the wood goes a long way in terms of material selection in the first place. And then also stick around towards the end of the video. I will talk a little bit about selecting pieces of wood from a length of dead standing to make your life easier with these techniques that I'm going to be sharing with you, one of which we've already looked at. Let's also have a think about the size of the wood. I talked about the length for this technique, with a half length axe being about the same length as the axe. Okay, we can work with pieces that are a little bit shorter. Okay, that's possible. You just have to be careful not to wrap your knuckles together when you're hitting. You maybe want to bring it like so, and then hit, rather than trying to keep your knuckles in the middle, because with a longer piece, the back of the handle there, where you've got this swell, you've got this knob on the end here, that's going to create a space for your knuckles to go into. But when the piece is shorter, there's nothing there to stop your knuckles going clonk onto there. So maybe you want to then hold that there and just rest the piece there, and again that will work like so. There's a limit to that though. This is going to be awkward, and it's also bringing your hand really quite close to the cutting edge of that tool. So I would recommend that you find a different technique for that. And we can look at some others. You could extrapolate from one of the other techniques that I'm going to show you to split this, or just use that as a smaller piece of main fuel. What I wouldn't be doing is trying to rest that on the ground and hitting it, or playing chicken with my own hand before it falls over. I don't want to split directly onto the ground with a piece of wood stood on its end, because again, if the axe goes all the way through, which it often does, it's going to hit whatever's underneath. Gritty soil, sandy soil, pebbles, rock, etc. It's just going to damage my axe. So I'm going to work onto a piece of wood, and I'll show you some other techniques in a second. All right, the limit really for this technique is what I can get hold of with one hand. Okay, and that's different for all of us. It depends on how big our hand is, how strong our wrists are, but really it's about this kind of size for most kind of adult men. It might be a little bit smaller for some other people, but basically something that you can get hold of in your hand, because you've got to hold the axe in the other hand and work with them together. If you can't hold that with one hand, you can't do this technique, right? And again, I will show you another technique where that will work. Okay, so that's kind of the limit for that. For example, this piece of wood, it's the right length, it's the same length as my axe pretty much, but it's really chunky, and I'm not going to be able to do that technique with that. But again, as I say, there is another technique which I'll show you. So you're really working with material that's ideal for splitting out into kindling, into quarters, into halves maybe, which a lot of the time, if you're splitting that into quarters, eighths, halves, that's the kind of size fuel that you need for stoves, it's what you need for campfires. You often don't need anything bigger than that, but sometimes we can't find pieces that size, and we'll look at some different techniques for that. The other thing to say about this, even if you do have a chopping block, if you were to try and stand that on its end and hit it from a distance, you've got a small target there, and that's going to be quite difficult to balance. So even though we're talking about not having chopping blocks, this is a technique for small pieces that you could use even if you did have a chopping block, because it's just easier to balance, it's less dynamic, you're not swinging an axe as far or as powerfully, you're not standing up, it's all very safe, which again, in a wilderness context, in a remote setting, that's something we want to be thinking about. So even with a chopping block, if you did happen to have a block or a sawn off tree that you're working on the stump, this technique will work well there as well, rather than trying to balance thin pieces precariously. Okay, so that's another parameter that you might want to think about while using this technique. But as I say, the limit really is what you can hold with one hand for this technique with a half axe. All right. What if we don't have a half axe though? What if we have a 3/4 axe, which again is one that's quite popular? I will come back to some of the techniques with this one presently, but let's have a think about the 3/4 length axe for a second. Okay, so I've got a couple of 3/4 length axes here. I've got this Scandinavian Forest Axe. Again, this is a Gransfors. I've got no connection with any of the axe manufacturers. This one here, for the longest time, this was my favorite 3/4 length axe. It's about 3/4 of the way from my sternum to my fingertips in terms of handle. The head is a very similar shape to the previous axe that I was using, but it is slightly larger and slightly heavier. I'll put the details below. This handle has been refinished as well. Very smooth, but also grippy. If you'd like a PDF on how to do that, free PDF, the link is underneath this video. You can download that for free from my website, and please do so, and please do this to your axe, because it makes it $1 million. It's absolutely amazing once you get this finish on it. So that's something for you to really pimp your axes up with. It makes them beautiful to use, beautiful to look at. They're more protected from moisture, and they'll last a long time. So I love these axes. I've used them a lot. I've used them a lot for winter camping. I've used them a lot for forestry work in places like this where I teach in the south of England. Great for limbing, great for bucking, even for taking branches off and for sectioning dead standing timber or even green timber. Great tool. Just the perfect height for taking side branches off felled trees. Also good light felling axe. It's about half the weight, the head is about half the weight of a full-size felling axe. So really like these axes, use them a lot, and I want to share some techniques with you. One that I've been using more and more recently that I really like now for winter camping is the Hultafors Qvarfot. I can never pronounce it correctly. Someone can correct me, although in the comments if you like, a Qvarfot, and that's got an 850 gram head. In fact, I believe, I don't think I'm speaking nonsense, I believe it's pretty much the same head in terms of weight, it certainly is, as you get on these Ekelund axes. Now, the two that I have here, the bit shape is slightly different, and the head is a little bit more rounded off on this one, but they both have 850 gram heads, and I'll come back to that because it does make a difference with some of these techniques, and we'll look at that in the latter part of the video. I know I'm talking a lot here, but I think the nuances here are important. It's not just about throwing the axe around, it's also what axe are we using, how heavy is it, what context are we using it in, and what wood are we attacking with it. All right, so this is a technique I use a lot in the winter when I do often have a 3/4 length axe with me on say a winter camping trip, and I'm not talking about the UK here, I'm talking about Scandinavia, or I'm talking about in the northern forest there, or I'm talking about some of the winter trips that we do in Ontario. We do a joint trip, and we have done the last few winters a joint trip with Lure of the North in Ontario, Canada, and this is a technique that we use a lot, and it'll work on snow as well. And again, slightly bigger log is useful, but we're going to be probably dealing with slightly bigger logs. We're felling dead standing timber for firewood to go into a wood burning stove, say in a snow trekker tent. You can put this onto the snow, you've got a bit of a platform, then you can put a bit of a broader log because it spreads the load, or you can just let it impact into the snow a bit once you're working on it. And then we can try and use the technique that we've just been doing. And it will work, but it's a little bit unwieldy. Like this into here, it's just a bit awkward just because of the length of the axe. Because you're holding the axe at this end as well, it puts quite a lot more strain on your wrist than the shorter axe where you'd be holding about that far away from the head, and also the head's heavier than the axe I was using. So it's just a little bit more awkward and unwieldy, and I can certainly feel it more on my forearm and my arm there as well, and I don't feel like I've got as much control. And also I might want to attack wood that's a bit bigger than what I can hold. So for all of those reasons, we're going to have a look at a different technique where I've definitely got a piece that's bigger. Grab this piece here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that over the front here. Now this does have a nice split down it already, and if you can get it to sit that way, maybe you can make use of that, but we'll ignore that for the time being. I'm going to lay it over the front, and again I'm going to be bringing the axe down over the log that's underneath. Now compared to where I was before, because this is a longer axe, I'm going to need to move back a little bit, and I'm also going to have maybe a little bit more curvature. Before I was coming pretty much straight down. Here I'm going to arc in a little bit, and that's going to help me because I want the axe to come onto here. Okay, I don't want to be hitting it in the middle there, I want to be hitting at this end, okay, like so. Okay, and again you can see I think I've come down onto the wood, I haven't gone beyond. And this is really quite nice and powerful, this technique. Getting these balanced on here can be a bit tricky. You need a sharp axe because hitting this, it needs to penetrate. It's a bit off center there, but that's going to sit perhaps a little bit better. And it is a bit more dynamic, things are flying off a bit more, but you can see I can start generating quite a lot of firewood. And again, if you wanted to, with the smaller pieces, you could go back to the hand holding technique, but as I say, I find that a bit tricky with a bigger axe. So you can make light work of some really quite heavy material there. It's probably about as big as you're going to want to fell in a winter situation, dead standing wood to break up into reasonable sized pieces for your stove, for example. This technique works really, really well in those situations. What about that in-between situation though, where you've got a half-length axe and you want to deal with something a bit bigger? Let's have a look at that now. So I'm back to my half-length axe, back to the Gransfors small forest axe for now. And let's have a think about, first off, something that's a bit short. It's not too big to hold, but it is a bit short. We can use that same technique. Yeah, we can use that same technique here, like so, okay? Long as the angle's not too steep, and if it is, maybe we use, you know, if it was too short, maybe we use a smaller piece. Where was that really short bit? There. So this was way too short for me to hold, yeah. But if I put it against that, that's awkward for me to hit. So if I put it on here, I need to be precise, I need to be accurate. But I can use that technique as well, just scale down what I was doing with the 3/4 with the larger log. So that's a crossover there that we can use as well. And again, just to reiterate, I'm kneeling, yeah, because if I do miss, if I do hit closer, even though I don't want to drive my axe into the ground, it's going to hit the ground before me. Even if I'm just crouching and I miss, my foot might be there. If I've got one knee down and one foot up, that's bad. Like if I miss, I could be going towards my foot. So kneeling makes a lot of these half axe techniques that we look at in videos, not just this video, it makes them much safer. Okay, let's have a look at a bigger piece. So this is what I was splitting with the 3/4. Now the disadvantage with the half is you've got less leverage than a 3/4, and in the case of the small forest axe, it's a lighter head as well. So I've got less mechanical advantage. This is a relatively easy to split species of wood, and I've chosen a relatively knot-free section. I've chopped between the knots, so it might well do this, but we'll see. No. Okay, it's just embedded in there. That's kind of what I hoped it would do, because you saw the 3/4 length axe with a slightly heavier head making easy work of this. I've scaled down to a half length axe with a lighter head, and it is finding this difficult. So what could we do? Let's have a look. I'm going to be careful to keep my fingers out the way while I get this axe out. Okay, so what we can do is we can think about batoning. A lot of people think about batoning with their knives. We certainly couldn't baton this with our knife, but I can baton it with an axe. So my dominant hand is my right. I'm going to hold the axe in my left. I'm going to find a chunky piece of wood that I can hold and use as a baton. I'm going to pop that into there. Can stand up to do this. That's fine. Got some control. Bark's coming off there. You want some weight behind the baton for sure. And there we go. Okay, so we can baton like that, and maybe then this technique will work with a half. That end's a bit punky. Yeah, but it is splitting it. Like so. It's been down on the ground, that's a bit damp, that piece. Okay, just out of interest, let's try the Hultafors half axe with the heavier head, the same weight head as the 3/4 length axe had. And again, this handle's been refinished. If you would like that free PDF guide, I think it's 12 pages on how to do this from start to finish, create this lovely gun stock finish on here. Just grab that for free. Link is below. There's no catch, just you can get it below. Okay, so heavier head, same length handle as the Gransfors, and that has done it more effectively than the lighter axes. Same length, heavier head, and then we're back into that situation where it's difficult to balance. If we want less than a quarter, We've got to try and split pieces off. And you can probably hear that it's got a bit more welly, a bit more weight. One thing to say about this technique that I didn't say at the beginning, but I think it's worth, if you're going to go and replicate this, I think it's worth you understanding, is that I was explicit about where the axe wants to be going over the top of this. And that's to protect the axe, but it's also protecting you with this technique. If I had the piece of wood here, where it's more like a seesaw, if I hit that end, it's potentially going to fly up towards me, and the axe is going to go into the ground close to my knee. So I do want that no further towards me than the log, yeah, resting on that log there. Doesn't want to go, this one, there's a knot in it. Yeah, you can see big knot in there. And that kind of brings me on to some of the things that I'm going to talk to you at the end. You want to try and choose pieces without knots in them because they're going to split more easily. So you might be asking, well, if something's a bit marginal for me to hold, can I use that technique? Yes, absolutely you can. Yeah, you might still be able to do that technique, but could you use this technique? Yeah, you can. But remember, it's just a bit more dynamic. You might get pieces flying off a bit more. You're swinging the axe a bit harder. You definitely want to give yourself a little bit more room with people moving around near to you. So that's gone there. And if you get a split going along quite nicely and it doesn't go all the way, rather than wrestling with it, just turn it around and see if you can hit on the same line pretty much. That has split now. And you can also go from the other side, like so. And there we go, nicely done. So be precise with your strikes, and you'll be nice and efficient then. This stuff's a little bit punky, you can see. It's sort of fracturing off, shearing off, but that's still going to burn quite nicely. It's nice and dry. Stuff that's a bit longer, can you still use that? Can you still use that in that technique? Yeah, absolutely. Again, just get your hand in between. Make sure you're not wrapping your knuckles. Think about what's going to fit more nicely. Like I'm going to knock my knuckles there. This is a bit curved. There, I've got a bit of a gap, but it's a bit harder to balance. So do what you're comfortable with. But just bear in mind where your knuckles are, and make sure you don't punch the wood like so. Nice, that's good. All right, something that long is starting to get a little bit too long. It's quite thin. It's not that you won't split the end of it, but you probably won't get the split to run all the way down. You'd be better off sawing that maybe into two smaller pieces, okay? Because you're going to struggle to hold that, a bit like the longer axe. You can see, I'm not doing that on purpose, it didn't want to go in there, there's a knot. Actually, that's gone quite nicely. Just a little trick for you, if you do get a split some of the way and it's bending like that, you can bring the axe up and leave her like that if you want to, but just don't get it too close to your fingers. Yeah, but do try and cut the pieces to a reasonable length. Not too short, not too long if you're using this technique. That's one of the first things in terms of material selection. The other one is species. The more you know about different species of wood, the better you will choose an appropriate species for this technique, something that's relatively straight grained, that doesn't have knots that are too horrible. Maybe a softwood cutting between those radial knots. and so you've got a relatively clean, straight-grained piece. Maybe some straight-grained hardwood. Once you get onto hardwoods that aren't always as amenable, so this is a piece of English oak, doesn't look too big. I can hold it with one hand. There's a bit of a knot here. This might still work, particularly with this heavier axe, but it's going to be harder work for sure. And it's a hot day here in the UK. That's actually gone. It's a bit punky there. It's a bit rotten. So it's not as tough as it might be, but it's certainly not splitting cleanly. Yeah, it's just smashing it up there. But if that was not too degraded, that would be quite difficult to split, and I'd be silly really to try and turn that into kindling. That's better off, that would be better off as a piece of fuel for roasting or slow cooking or what have you. And then if you got onto something like this is a piece of dead spiny oak with lots of side branches. Never in a million years are you going to get these hand techniques to work with this. It's just too tough, it's too knotty, very hard wood. Yeah, you can. So this is really knotty. Side branch, it's just going to be super difficult to split. You'd be much better off just either using it as a solid piece of fuel like that in a campfire that's going to keep going for a long time, or putting it down and using that to split onto. That would be a nice solid bit. You can see how I'm chewing through this. This is still a hardwood, but it's a softer hardwood than this. I'm chewing through this. This might last a bit longer. So that would be a good use for that. And then you could use it for firewood afterwards. Okay, now I would just like to take you over here, just have a look at a piece of wood that was dead standing that I brought over, just to have a look at how I would section this up. And this might seem obvious to people who know this, but I see people making these mistakes unless I point them out to them. And so what I've got here, I've got this piece of wood here. There's obvious side branches here, here and here. All right, there's a knot just here. You've got smaller knots higher up. Lower down, you've got this area, and you can see how you've got these. It depends on the species, but you often get like various knots, side branches, all in the same area, and then you don't get much going on until a bit further along. The same here. You've got a kind of concentration of side branches here, or what were side branches. And this is a hardwood, but you see it with softwood species as well. You see it with pines. They're even a little bit more symmetrical than this, where you have radial knots going out, and you have radial knots all coming out around different areas. And you can see that sometimes with rotten wood, you get those things that look a bit like a starfish, where that you have those kind of resin infused concentrated areas of knots that are still together, and the rest of the wood is all rotted away. So the point here being really that with a lot of these species, these areas are going to be problematic to split, and these areas are going to be problematic to split, particularly with the techniques that were talked about. But in between, it's relatively clean. And yeah, always check on the other side. Just make sure there's not some great hoofing side branch coming out. But that's clean between here and here. So if I wanted to use one of these techniques with a relatively small axe, where to work this into firewood and maybe some kindling, I would saw this off here, and then I would measure it, so that if I was using a hand splitting technique, measure it to the length of my axe. But that's about there. Saw that off there, and then maybe get another section out of here. And yeah, it's a bit more sawing. That's true. It is a bit more sawing if you're going to be sawing out section with knots, but you might not, with some species, you might not get it split otherwise. One other option though for you to try though, if you are going to have knots in here, you want them towards the end, not the middle. Okay, so looking back at this piece of wood here, I think that's in focus. What I wouldn't want to do, for example, is to saw it here and saw it there. That might be the length of my axe handle, but then you've got these great big knots in the middle that are going to be really hard. It's going to hold it together. It's going to be hard to split those out. And I can't even attack them directly with the axe because it's in the middle of the piece. But if I did have to have some knots in here, what I'd want to do is saw it here, and then come down here and saw it there, and then have this clean section, and then the knots at the end, because then that gives me two advantages. One is I can attack the knots directly with the axe into there, and also I can attack the clean end and get that to split, and then that split can run all the way down here, and that gives me a lot of leverage to work against these knots at this end in terms of just levering the whole thing apart, like I did with one of those other pieces earlier. So if you're going to have knots in, have them very close to one end of the piece that you saw. Ideally you don't have them at all. Like I wouldn't really want to be trying to do hand splitting with this stuff in here. I just saw that off. Might be able to get away with attacking this, especially with a heavier head axe. So those are just some things for you to think about with material selection. So you want dead standing wood, you want stuff that's not too rotten. For firewood, then you want to think about where you saw it, you want to think about the length of it, you want to, if you do know the species, think about how it splits. The more experience you get, the better you will know how different species split, and then apply the techniques safely and cleanly. And remember, we had three techniques. We had the hand splitting technique, we had with a half length axe, we had the kind of overlog splitting technique with the 3/4 axe, and then we had the batoning technique, which will work with either actually. I did it with a half length axe, but you can do it with a 3/4 length axe as well. That will work well with that. And then of course you can go back to one of the other techniques to split it down more finely if you want to after that. So some really, really good techniques to have in your repertoire, particularly if you're going into woods that don't have a setup with a chopping block area, or you're traveling where you're just producing firewood as you go for a winter camp or a canoe journey, or if you're just working in the woods for a short period of time and you don't have a more serious setup with a splitting maul and a chopping block. Brilliant, brilliant techniques. Ones I use them all the time. Okay, so hope you found that useful. Don't forget to get that PDF of how to refinish your axe handle if you'd like to. And also have a check out of the next video that's coming up in the suggestions, how to sharpen an axe. That's really useful as well if you haven't seen it. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And of course, all that like, subscribe, ring the bell, all that stuff as well, please. Great to have your support. Appreciate you watching this, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video before too long. Take care. Cheers.